Welcome to the Giving USA 2024 webinar sponsored by Dunham+Company, which is looking back at giving in 2023 and the trends we are seeing not only for overall giving, but giving by source and the type of recipient organizations. I'm Rick Dunham, founder and chair of Dunham+Company, and I'm delighted to welcome my good friend and colleague, Dr. Una Osili. Una's been a great friend, and I got to tell you, she's one of the most respected researchers in philanthropy around the globe. She's led the research team for Giving USA at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy for over a decade and is highly regarded, as I mentioned, as one of the top experts on philanthropy globally. I know that Una's time is in very high demand, so it's a real honor to have her join us today. Una, thank you for taking the time out of your incredibly busy schedule to share the findings from Giving USA 2024 with our audience today. And I'll turn it over to you now. Take it away.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all of you who've joined, especially big thanks to our colleagues at Dunham & Company for hosting this webinar. It's also just a pleasure to partner and collaborate on this release of the report. Every year when we launch Giving USA, we have opportunities around the country to speak. And so all of you who've joined us are among the first still in the country because we just launched the report late in June to hear this information. So I look forward to your questions, your insights, and hopefully your ideas about how giving is changing. As you've heard, Giving USA is the annual report on American giving. It's the longest running report of its kind. It dates back to the 1950s. So we have a chance to not just take the temperature on how giving is evolving here in the United States, but also place this in context and how is giving changing? What does it look like? And what does this mean for the future and for all of our various segments of the work? So with that as a background, let's take you behind the scenes to learn all about Giving USA 2024 and also the implications for your day-to-day work in philanthropy. As Rick mentioned, at the Lilly Family School, we partner every year with the Giving USA Foundation to produce this report, but this is also a chance to acknowledge all of our colleagues that contribute to this project at the Lilly Family School and Giving USA. Dunham & Company has been a longtime partner on this project, so this is also a chance to thank Rick and his colleagues for their contributions. So there's so much data to explore, and the question we always get asked is, where should we start as we think about giving in 2023 and also in 2024? So a bit of a look back, but also looking forward. The place to start is really the big picture. And to prepare for this every year, our team sifts through literally thousands of data points to come up with some of the big takeaways from this year's report. So I'm going to take you behind the scenes with the very first finding. And the first finding is, for me, one of the most consequential, and that is in 2023, giving totaled $557 billion. We want to really take stock of the giving landscape at this juncture because during the pandemic, we had an opportunity to see Americans respond generously to the crises, both at home and around the world. And so during the pandemic, giving grew. And what we always say at a time when there was tremendous uncertainty, global pandemic, lots of economic shocks at the local and global level, and the racial and social justice concerns of that era, many Americans responded with unprecedented generosity. So at this point, we can say that generosity was resilient in the face of many of the changes that we all saw, and individuals in the nonprofit sector, the fundraising community, the leaders, the frontline workers, many of them had to innovate and also just adapt to the changing environment. As it stands, giving is still resilient, and as we look ahead, we have a lot of optimism about the future of philanthropy, given all the innovations that are taking place in the sector. Now, let's think about and also pause to say, how has the giving landscape changed over the past few years, but also looking back even over the last decade or so, and even several decades. One of our big insights from all of our work on this data this year is that Americans are, of course, generous, and that generosity is a shared value across households. But households still make up the largest share of American giving, meaning individual giving, giving by families of all different backgrounds, still comprise the lion's share of American giving at 67%. When we look back, rewind the tape, Giving USA gives us that opportunity, we note that individual giving accounted for a much larger slice of the pie in the 1980s and even in the 1950s and 60s. In fact, when we look back in the early years of Giving USA, individual giving was close to 90% of all giving. So if we had to ask ourselves what has changed in the last decade or so, it's that foundations now account for a very significant slice of the pie. In fact, 1 out of every 5 charitable dollars comes from a foundation. What does this mean for all of you in your work? Well, it means that we still have to place the highest priority on individuals, building those personal relationships with donors and retaining donors over time. However, it's become increasingly important to also think about a more diversified strategy, which involves adding foundation giving. When we think about foundations, the of course opportunity there is that with economic growth in the last few years, especially in financial markets, foundations have seen their asset values grow. And many foundations are thinking about how do they increase a lot of their funding in the communities that they work in. However, foundations are made up of small foundations that are not professionally staffed. Those we often refer to them as family foundations because 1 or 2 individuals are making decisions. So if we were to take the individual segment, add half of the foundation segment, which is family foundations, and also integrate or incorporate charitable bequests, we would have 86%. So very similar to what we had in the early days of Giving USA, coming from individuals, both living and deceased. So what else has changed in this year's report in addition to the outsized impact of foundations? It's also that charitable bequests are accounting for a larger and larger slice of the pie. You can see on this chart that in the 1980s, charitable bequests made up about 6%. So we've seen bequests grow. And as we look ahead beyond 2024, perhaps, we estimate that charitable bequests will continue to grow in their influence in American philanthropy simply because the US population does have a large slice of the population that is aging. We tend to think about it as a top-heavy distribution. And these are individuals that are reaching their peak giving years and are starting to think about their legacy gifts. So the recommendation, certainly for many organizations, is to think about how they can buttress their planned giving programs and start to build those legacy opportunities for their donors. And then finally, corporate giving. Corporate giving is one that we have watched very closely over time because we've seen corporations certainly take a bigger, let's say, more visible place in philanthropy in the areas they work in and also in the various opportunities that they've engaged in, especially during the pandemic. Corporate giving seems relatively stable. It was 6% in the 80s, it's 7% now. But when we look more carefully at those numbers, we'll note that corporations increasingly are very strategic in their giving. Some of them are giving through their foundations, but there are others that are giving through many different channels. Some of them are not the traditional philanthropy buckets. That includes sponsorships. It also includes marketing partnerships and even impact investments. So we do see quite a bit of change, not all of it in corporate philanthropy. So again, an area to watch, corporate philanthropy, simply because over the last few years, many companies have seen their corporate profits, pre-tax profits rebound, and that provides more resources. So quick summary, individual giving is still the lion's share of American philanthropy, but there are opportunities ahead, especially around foundation giving and corporate giving. as well as bequests. So let's go to the second finding. And here, this is an opportunity to really think about what took place over the last few years. The pandemic era, as we've termed it, turns out to be, and this is a big surprise for many who watch the data very closely, turned out to be some of the best giving years on record. This is very encouraging news for those of us in the philanthropic sector, because at a time that many analysts were not sure how the giving sector would evolve during the pandemic, we found that actually 2021 was the best year of giving on record. So during the pandemic, giving actually grew. And you could say that the generosity that we saw during the pandemic meant several things. First, Americans responded to the needs they saw in their communities, but a strong economy also helped buttress giving. In other words, giving tends to grow when households feel economically and financially secure. During the pandemic, we know that, and this has continued, some households were able to strengthen their balance sheets. These are the folks that were working from home and also saw that they weren't spending as much because they were not taking vacations and not engaging in a lot of eating out and entertainment. And so households were in a very strong position to give. In the last few years, we've seen the stock market grow, and that has continued to strengthen the giving economy. The most recent period, 2023, is an interesting time to think about giving. Giving grew in current dollars, but it did not keep pace with inflation. And that's because, as many of you know, the pandemic era has also been accompanied by relatively high inflation. 8% in some years, it's come down significantly, but we are not yet back to the pre-pandemic era of very low inflation. So big context here is that the pandemic era turned out to be, and as a surprise to many, a very encouraging time for the charitable sector. And that trend has continued even in the current period. And I have taken this news to really mean that we have lots of opportunities to engage with donors, especially the ones that have been able to accumulate savings. And even with some of the challenges this nation has faced during this period, there have been many households that have really stepped up in their generosity. The last point on thinking through 2023 and the big picture is also to recognize what are the factors that are driving giving, what factors have been driving giving, and what do we expect to see going forward. In the past few years, we've had a number of factors that have increased giving, but we've also had factors that have led to perhaps more challenges around giving. So let me start with the positive factors. We've had overall economic indicators that have led many households to increase their giving, especially the stock market. But we've also had above average inflation rates in this period. As we look ahead, the growth we saw in 2023 overall suggests that we have a lot of positive signs for philanthropy moving forward. One of my takeaways from looking at this year's report is that many predicted in 2023 and even 2024 that the US would actually have a recession. Well, so far, the economy has been stronger than many expected. We've been able to avert that recession. And in fact, the conclusion is that the US economy has actually performed better than most expected, and that we have emerged with that soft landing that many expected. So that is great context for anyone working in the field right now, because rather than any other message, the message here is really that generosity has been resilient and that the indicators suggest that this will continue. Now, when we say that giving is linked to economic factors, I often get asked by many, what are the indicators that we should be paying attention to? And there are many, of course, that you can select, but one of the indicators that we pay a lot of attention to here is the gross domestic product. In other words, an overall picture of how the economy is performing. And what we saw in 2023 is that for the most part, the estimates suggested that the economy was growing and therefore giving was growing. And in fact, throughout the past year and even this year, we've seen those trends continue. In addition, you could also look at other indicators, including what's happening with personal income, employment numbers. And for those of you who are really thinking about balance sheets for both corporations and households, certainly looking at measures around savings and, of course, inflation are all good indicators to watch. So that is the exceptional news coming out of this year, that giving actually performed better than we might have expected given the news at the beginning of 2023. Now for the challenge. As we look at the growth in giving, one sobering fact is that total giving as a share of GDP has remained relatively stable at 2%. In other words, although giving is growing, it is not necessarily growing as fast as the overall economy. And what this means is that as a share of household budgets, giving is relatively stable at 2%. So a challenge for all of us today joining the webinar is, what would we have to do differently in our families, in our communities, and as a nation to move the needle above 2%? You can see that during the 1990s, a period of great economic prosperity, we saw that top line number increase, but still around that 2%. And during the pandemic, we did see an uptick in the share that households were allocating to charitable giving, but we still hovered around the 2%. So some have said we need policies that strengthen and incentivize charitable giving. Others have thought, well, we have a giving pledge for our highest income Americans, highest net worth Americans. What if we drilled down and had giving pledges for everyday donors? The great news here is that there's a lot of room for all of us to participate in actually conversations about charitable giving. At the Lilly Family School, we have some really fascinating research that shows that children, young people, respond very favorably to charitable conversations. And that's actually the most effective way to encourage young people to engage in philanthropy, is through charitable conversations. So that is yet another vehicle that all of us have access to influence the next generation of donors. So we have covered the big picture, and now I'd like to take you once again behind the scenes to understand the giving environment. What's driving the numbers, and what does this mean for the future? As we look at the big picture, there's also an opportunity to go into each individual segment of giving and see how the various segments stack up. In general, as we have thought through each of these areas, individual giving was perhaps the part of giving that seemed to have been affected by inflation, because when we adjust for inflation, we see that that source of giving declined. On a more positive note, corporations and foundations, if we look at their 2-year average, they experienced a positive trend even after we adjust for inflation. So overall, even though we see growth in giving, this growth did not keep pace with inflation. However, corporations and foundations experienced an even, I'd say, more positive outlook, because adjusting for inflation over a 2-year period, they still saw an increase. In general, because individual giving is such an important piece of the puzzle, we spend a lot of time trying to understand what's driving giving by individuals. This particular period, we have seen an uptick during the pandemic, as I've noted, but following the pandemic, lots of volatility in the global and national economic picture. You all know that during the pandemic, we had all of the challenges that sort of surfaced, including supply chain issues, which put upward pressure on prices. And this meant that in 2022, we had perhaps a more challenging year. In 2023, however, most of the indicators that we track turned out to be surprisingly encouraging. And that's because most analysts had predicted perhaps a much less favorable outlook for the economy. So I'll just recap by saying that one indicator that we pay very close attention to is the stock market. And in 2023, S&P grew by over 20% in current dollars. And when we adjust for inflation, it's still in the double digits. We also saw consumers show a lot of strength in 2023, and that has continued in 2024. So disposable income growing and also consumer spending, which tends to track very closely with charitable giving. Giving by foundations is also a place where we spent a lot of time in this year's report. As I noted, the stock market performance has meant that many foundations are in a very strong position as far as their grant making is concerned, and they are often thinking about how do they allocate those resources to their nonprofit partners. In addition, during the pandemic, many foundations also thought very carefully about ways of supporting their nonprofit partners with unrestricted giving becoming more widespread, more prevalent. We also saw many foundations really think about how to simplify their grant review process and in addition to that, put more emphasis on participation by communities in their work. But what is also worth emphasizing is that with a very strong stock market growth over the last few years, giving by foundations has now crossed the $100 billion mark. And this is the second year in a row. We've seen many large funders use their foundations to really accelerate work in a particular area. Some of those areas include climate funding, but also areas around education, health, basic needs, and many other causes. The sixth finding for this presentation is what took place with charitable bequests. We saw bequests grow in 2023 as a result of some of the demographic shifts that we have emphasized. In the past few decades, bequests have generally represented about 10% of giving, but there's also been quite a bit of data shared over the past few decades about what's called the wealth transfer, the great wealth transfer that's anticipated with a large share of our population reaching those peak giving years and starting to think about the passing of the torch to the next generation. Early estimates were that about $81 trillion would change hands over the next few decades, and now we are in that period of the great wealth transfer. The early indicators suggest that older Americans have accumulated significant assets. Data from the Survey of Consumer Finances shows that households, older adults, this is 55 and over, their wealth grew by about 30%. So looking ahead, demographic shifts and economic factors suggest that bequests will be an important area for many nonprofits, and we're already starting to see those results. Quite a few of the nonprofits who made investments in planned giving are beginning to see the fruits of their labor. And organizations that generally did not have this expertise are starting to incorporate this in their planning for the future, just simply because of our demographic profile in many communities around the United States, and also the fact that older Americans have actually built up savings and are now starting to think about their legacy giving. Now for the seventh finding. In general, our work on corporate giving also suggests that many corporations in the past few years have seen their corporate profits rebound. Corporations did have mixed experiences during the pandemic, depending on the sector that they worked in. But we did see that as some of the economic challenges eased, companies saw an uptick in their profits, and giving also tracked very closely with those pre-tax profits. In addition to what we saw during the pandemic and in the post-pandemic period, we also have been following closely how corporations are innovating in their approach to philanthropy. Although corporate foundations are still prevalent in the sector, many companies are using multiple vehicles and channels to target the causes that they care about, a more strategic approach, but also incorporating matching gifts into their process. We saw that some companies actually increased their matching during the pandemic from a one-to-one match to, in some cases, a 3-to-1 match. And companies are increasingly thinking about workplace giving as part of their employee development, engagement, and retention. So for many organizations and nonprofits who want to build relationships with corporate partners, the key has been how to provide multiple engagement points for those companies. As we look through our findings for this year, a place that we've also spent some time, and I see some questions coming through, so please keep them coming, is to look at where giving is going. In addition to who's donating, we're also very interested in the destination of those charitable dollars. There we have quite a bit of change taking place. One of the largest changes that we have been witnessing is the share of giving that's allocated to congregations has actually been declining. In the 1960s, 2/3 of all charitable dollars went to congregations. And today you can see that that is down to 1/3. The picture is so striking that I actually reached out to one of my colleagues who was in a leadership role for a long time at the Lake Institute for Faith and Giving here at the Lilly Family School. I was very interested in his thoughts about what's changing and why. And one of his reflections as someone who started his career in the 50s and 60s, leading several large congregations, is that a lot of the changes we're seeing reflect changes in religious attendance patterns, with fewer people attending services every week, but also changing affiliation patterns. However, the point that I think all of our research points to is although giving to congregations as a share of the total is declining and quite significantly, many Americans give because of their values, because of their faith traditions, because of the role that their faith plays in how they make their giving decisions. So we don't want to in any way say that faith and philanthropy are very much intertwined, and especially as we look at the various types of nonprofits in human services, in education, in healthcare. We know that the nonprofit sector is definitely influenced and enriched by America's faith traditions. It's just that the destination of giving today, the map of giving today, looks very different than what it looked like in the 1950s, 60s, and even in the 70s and 80s. Let me also talk about what else has changed in this map. One finding that really stood out to our team is that human services, which used to be really the third largest segment of the pie, has grown over time and now makes up the second largest. It's very close to education, but during the pandemic, we saw many Americans step up their giving to basic needs charities. And so today, that has continued. Education is still one of the largest destination points for American donors, and you can see that that's at about 14%. Two areas that we've also been tracking very closely are giving to the environment and giving internationally. The last few years with the war in Ukraine, Americans have been very generous to humanitarian efforts around the world, and especially with the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. And the environment is attracting more support, especially from younger Americans. We've also seen, especially during the pandemic, that individuals have given to seen some of the shifts taking place with some types of organizations getting more attention in the wake of the pandemic. So our team spends a lot of time with this data, and our big takeaway really is that the organizations that have done well and the sectors that have done well and rebounded during the pandemic are really, if you drill down into the data, the organizations that were able to innovate and pivot during all the changes that took place. One example of this that we saw is arts and culture has actually rebounded, and many arts organizations had to start to figure out how to engage with their audiences, not just in person, but virtually. And with the post-pandemic period, many of those organizations have continued to reach wider audiences and engage donors from many different locations simply because they adapted to the changing needs of the environment. I mentioned briefly that we have been tracking very closely to see which of the subsectors have more or less recovered from the stresses and challenges of the pandemic. And what we saw in 2023 is that the subsectors, the segments that grew the most in 2023 were generally the areas where high net worth donors tend to give. And to be more specific, we saw giving to education, to foundations, and to arts and culture tend to rebound. And even after we adjust for inflation, we still see recovery in 2023. We also saw that many donors were returning to support the organizations they had supported prior to the pandemic, especially high net worth donors. And that many of these subsectors were also, and this is a very important point, were able to adapt and really meet donors where they were in terms of new modes of engagement. And that's a lesson that I think we're still really trying to better understand. But it's very clear that organizations that built that innovation muscle were able to not just weather the storm, but also continue to perform well in the era following the pandemic. Now that we've covered all of these key findings, we're going to now turn our attention to turn our lens to look into the future. Most of the results you've heard today focus in on 2023. That's the year that we just completed. We have final information on how the economy performed. As we look ahead in 2024, we're already almost more than halfway through the year, and we've been able to start to put together what this first half of the year looks like and what that means for giving. On the economic data front, I think overall the news has been fairly encouraging. In other words, inflation, while still high, is moderating, meaning many households are seeing easing up of those inflationary pressures. Overall, the economy is still doing much better than analysts have predicted. So I think that's also good news. And then in terms of some of the challenges, which we can't ignore, of course, around the world, geopolitical tensions that continue to pose challenges for especially nonprofits working in those areas. And then as we think about closer to home, lots of uncertainty about the changing political landscape and also changes ahead in tax laws and many other areas pose challenges. On the good news front, continued innovation in the charitable sector with new technologies, artificial intelligence, both providing lots of new opportunities, but also some hurdles for nonprofits in terms of building trust. At the beginning of this year, one of the themes we really focused on is the role of trust. Donors give to organizations that they trust, and our concern was really with all of this change taking place. Nonprofits currently are among the most trusted of institutions in America, and maintaining this trust is going to be paramount. So let's look at what we see about the future of giving in 2024 and beyond. So we'll start with the types of giving segments and what we're expecting. As I noted, the parts of the sector that struggled the most in 2023 were the segments that did not keep up with inflation. Religious congregations, giving to congregations specifically, is still the largest slice of the pie, even though it has fallen as an overall, its market share, you could say, has been reduced. And we saw that giving to religious congregations did not keep pace with inflation. We've done some additional work to look by type of congregation, which ones fared better during the pandemic. And once again, the message is congregations that were able to adapt, to find ways of adapting and also instituting mobile forms of giving and tech-powered ways of giving, so that when people weren't able to be in person, they could still contribute to the congregation, tended to fare much better. On the specific charitable organization segment, we also saw that international affairs had some strong years during the pandemic, but in 2023, with less emphasis on the war in Ukraine from a humanitarian perspective, many international organizations did not do as well overall in 2023. In general, though, when we look by recipient type, the news is that organizations have tended to recover from the pandemic, and even in inflation-adjusted dollars are doing quite well. And as we think about what 2024 and beyond, what those challenges are, I think it's also important to note that inflation doesn't just affect donors, it also affects the nonprofits. It increases the cost of doing business, it increases delivering services to clients is also costlier. And another pressure that many nonprofits continue to face in 2024 is talent engagement. Many nonprofits are competing in a very tough labor market. Unemployment is low, which means much more difficult to hire and also to retain talent. And so that's another theme when we think about these economic indicators. It doesn't just affect donors, it also affects the nonprofits as they seek to conduct their work and accomplish their mission. So overall, it was, I'd say, a picture of recovery for the nonprofit sector in 2023. And most recipient categories, most destination points for charitable giving saw a rebound in their giving. With some of these challenges on the horizon, I think the key for many nonprofit organizations is also to continue to adapt, because as you can see, this is not a static landscape, and also find ways to mitigate some of these both rising costs, talent, attraction, and retention. And then finally, this is a point where we actually spend a lot of time every year thinking about, now that we've shared all this data, what does this mean for the nonprofit sector, both individual organizations, but also the sector as a whole? I think there is some encouraging news and actually inspiring news in this year's report. In general, philanthropy has shown tremendous resilience during some very tough years for many organizations. But also, in addition, the sector has emerged perhaps more poised for technological adaptation. With many new ways of giving, donor advised funds were certainly part of the landscape before the pandemic. They have continued to expand in their influence. We're also seeing many new ways that individuals are engaging in philanthropy. One indicator that we track to just get a sense of this is the percentage of giving that takes place online. For most of the past decade, it's been under 10%. During COVID, we saw that top line number go up to 12%, even closer to 13%. So overall, online giving is a larger share. More people are giving online. That's also mobile-enabled giving. And we've seen one of the most interesting things I have been watching in terms of new ways of giving is even charitable gaming. Video games that people can watch professional video game players and actually raise money for charities. And I saw that for the first time during COVID. That has continued to expand. As we look at also what's driving success in giving and fundraising right now, it's three particular issues. One is building the planned giving space, the legacy gifts. Organizations that have that as a strength are actually ones that to watch right now because they're starting to see that segment of giving do quite well. A big success factor has also been donor retention. Many organizations saw the influx of new donors during COVID. In other words, people who had never given to them showed up in their donor bases, but not all organizations have been able to retain them. So one thing we mentioned quite a bit is the role of donor retention in this environment that we're dealing with. And then finally, because of the demographic picture, many nonprofits in the United States, I would even say most, have top heavy distribution, meaning they have many established donors, older donors, but not as many younger donors. So next gen donors have to be part of the equation, building a pipeline of future donors. This is true in higher education, but it's also true across the board. And when we think about younger donors, they come with a lot of certainly a sense of urgency about their work. During the pandemic, we were able to conduct interviews with many of these next gen donors. They think of giving quite broadly. It's not just their time, their talent, and treasure, but it's also about how they use their voice. They are very interested in movements, advocacy, getting involved. And so we have started to think about it's not just the three T's anymore. It's time, it's talent, it's treasure, but it's also testimony, allowing donors to use their social media and other platforms to help tell your story. And then we've also thought about ties as another T. And this is the notion that each donor is part of a network. And especially in this very tightly networked social media landscape that we all occupy, when you build a relationship with one donor, you also have an opportunity to tap into their entire network. So we're increasingly thinking about expanding the pipeline also means expanding our ways of engaging those donors and thinking about all the different talents and assets they bring. And then finally, as many organizations are thinking about the future, there's a big sort of two-pronged set of issues that have to be on everybody's radar. Certainly investing in new technologies. AI is at the top of everybody's list. In higher education, ChatGPT took us all by surprise, but now I think many have adapted to these new technologies and are starting to think about what are the possibilities? How can I use this in my work to build efficiency? At the same time, relationships are still the currency in the nonprofit sector. So how do we also build trust and trusting relationships with our donors? And I feel this moment also calls for us to double down on talent in many of our organizations. The key to success, to achieving our mission, to driving change in our communities involves not just building relationships externally, but also building relationships internally. And that includes developing our talent, investing in our talent. So I'd like to just, of course, start to conclude here by saying I'd love to hear from you, your questions, your comments, and also what are your surprises as you listen to this presentation and your ideas for areas you'd like to see future research. So I'll stop and I will turn it over to our moderator, Rick Dunham.
Thank you, Una. We have several questions that have come in, so we'll open these up to you and to Rick to answer. And a couple of questions early on here. Could you point us to a set of definitions for the categories you are presenting, like religion, public health, et cetera? I think this is a question Rick can take for us.
Sure. And Una, thank you very, very much. Super practical, very helpful. So the categories that you see for recipient organizations are based on the National Taxonomy of Exempt Entity Codes. And you'll see them abbreviated NTEE, developed by the IRS back in the 80s. And so when and it's actually is a really important question, because when you look at the definition for what is giving to religion, and Una, correct me if I'm wrong on this or miss something, but giving to religion is giving to congregations, denominations, to mission, and to religious media. I think that covers it, doesn't it, Una?
Yes, you're correct. You covered everything. And if you're interested in the details, because it sounds like there's some people on the webinar that are strong data folks, in the report itself, there is a methodology section that drills down into all the different categories and explains them in more detail. So if you're interested in any of that, we can certainly share the links to get the actual materials.
Yeah, it's good. So, and the other thing I was going to mention too is that giving to religion does not equate to religiously motivated giving. And this is something Una and I have talked a lot about over the years, is that there are organizations that will receive funding through religious motivation. Think of Compassion International, Samaritan's Purse, World Vision, who will show up in international affairs, but in fact, many donors supporting them are religiously motivated in doing so. Same thing with Christian higher education, et cetera. So giving to religion is a very narrow definition when it comes to actually that category.
Well, the next question also kind of dovetails with that. In the religion recipient category, do you know the percentage breakouts between houses of worship and faith-based nonprofits? I think you might have already answered that.
Yeah, and that was part of the point, is that faith-based nonprofits don't necessarily fit into that category. They're going to fit into education, international human services, et cetera.
Great. A couple of questions about foundations and donor-advised funds. Do the foundation numbers include donor-advised funds and family foundations now, Rick? Rona?
Yes, so I'm happy to jump in here. We capture donor advice funds in many different ways, and it's a complex process. So I'll start with, on the giving side, it's usually individuals that set up donor advice funds, so they are counted under individual giving. But when it comes to destination of giving, this is where it gets much more complicated and really quite nuanced. So let's start with the obvious categories. There are the National Donor Advice Funds that includes Fidelity, Schwab Charitable, and Vanguard Charitable. Those are called our public society, or they are situated in our public society benefits. That refers to umbrella categories. In other words, a lot of regranting to other sectors, and so we situate a lot of the national funds under public society benefit. However, we have a number of other donor advised funds that reside in other segments. Community foundations, for example, are under giving by foundations. And yet a third category of donor advised funds are what we call single issue charities. And that includes educational institutions that have DAFs. For example, Indiana University, you can set up a DAF at the IU Foundation. That would be under education, because under that educational umbrella, most of your giving from your DAF, if it's set up at the Indiana University Foundation, will go to education. Of course, you can give to other purposes. So we try to reflect the complexity of DAFs. And if you're interested in going into this in much more detail, we now have a chapter in the Giving USA book that's now out just on what's happening with donor advised funds.
Great. And what impact do you think the federal government's checks, transfer payments to Americans around the pandemic contributed to 2021's high watermark?
It's a great question. We're actually looking at that right now. And what's quite interesting from the data is that Americans were a lot more resilient than we might have expected. And one theory is that those stimulus checks, both the ones that were sent to households, but also the ones that self-employed individuals, people who own businesses, were able to benefit from, and even state and local governments. Many of them received stimulus funds to help offset some of the shortfalls they were facing. So what we're starting to see, which is perhaps both intriguing but also quite interesting, is that overall, although the pandemic did have a very adverse effect on many households and communities, both in terms of illness and work disruptions and employment, there was also a segment of the population that was able to work from home, that, as you noted, received and benefited from stimulus funding. And importantly, many of those households were not spending as much, so they actually had more resources to give. And the message here in general is that Americans are generous. They give to their causes that really matter to them, and that giving is a core value for many households. In this very difficult set of challenges in many communities, many people stepped up their giving, and the stimulus and other government supports may have helped produce that feeling of more financial and economic security that might have otherwise been there. We're still unraveling all of these details, but that's the picture that's emerging so far.
Una, I have another question that may feel like to some it's out of left field, but I think it's pertinent. Do we have any data around the impact of the 2017 legislation, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, and the raising of the standard deduction threshold and its potential impact on giving?
Yes, in fact, several of my colleagues, Dr. Mark Wilhelm and a colleague at Notre Dame, Professor Dan Hungerman, just launched a paper this week. It's a National Bureau of Economic Research working paper that shows that the expected impact of the TCJA, Tax Cut and Jobs Act, did have a negative impact on charitable giving. And of course, the size of that is still hard to measure, but they're estimating about $20 billion less. And the argument there is really that for many Americans, they were receiving tax recognition for their giving because they itemized their charitable giving, and now they're no longer receiving that incentive. So that is some of the initial data that we're finding. Now, as many of you know, next year, the TCJA will be up for review. And so there's a lot of conversation about, is there a way to make sure that more Americans can benefit through the tax code? The charitable deduction is the longest, sort of oldest deduction in our tax code. It had been around for more than 100 years. And prior to TCJA, about 30% of Americans actually itemized their gifts on their taxes every year and got some tax benefit. Today, that's down to less than 10%, meaning most people are taking the standard deduction, which has some advantages because it's simpler to file your taxes. But the disadvantage is that incentive is not able to be received more broadly. So these are the really important questions that we'll be asking starting in 2025.
Una, what role is our platforms like GoFundMe playing in charitable giving now? And what categories are most impacted by those?
Yeah, so this is a great question. I'm so glad this came up. Many of us have, of course, given through GoFundMe or have also been solicited to support a cause on GoFundMe. What we have been doing over the past few years is spending a lot more time trying to understand how much of the GoFundMe dollars are geared towards what are called person-to-person transfers. So those do not end up with a nonprofit, or how much is being basically raised for a nonprofit cause. And we also have another category. Some people are raising funds on GoFundMe, not for a nonprofit or for an individual, but also for a business. So when we looked at this data, we found that almost 40% of Americans are now giving either to crowdfunding or to via social media platform, which means crowdfunding is actually growing. The amounts that are given on GoFundMe tend to be relatively small, less than $100 for each person. However, when we look at the data, not all of it is person to person. People are raising money for nonprofits on GoFundMe as well, and a smaller segment are going towards businesses. what we found in the results that we've analyzed is that generally speaking, people who are giving on GoFundMe are also quite charitable and they're donating to nonprofits. So we haven't necessarily seen that one is displacing the other, at least so far. What is different about charitable giving compared to GoFundMe is that when you donate to a nonprofit, there is a mechanism for accountability, transparency, and also, of course, the potential tax benefit, which is not necessarily the case for a gift on GoFundMe. However, what crowdfunding gives you is a very quick, efficient, and sometimes a frictionless way to contribute. And donors and potential donors also appreciate the fact that they get real-time feedback on how their gift is making a difference. So I think there's a lot to learn from the growth of crowdfunding and the fact that many Americans can not just give via GoFundMe and other platforms, but are increasingly seeing that as a way of solving problems when they have a particular need, setting up a campaign to help address that need rather than necessarily thinking, it just suggests that there are many different ways in this very fast-paced and changing landscape to address societal issues.
Thank you, Una. Rick, here's one for you. What was the total charitable giving in 1983?
So I want to repeat something that Una said earlier, is that obviously there's some of you who are a little bit data nerds and love to get into some of this data. And one of the things I love about Giving USA is the depth of content there. So we have a portion of the book called the data tables, which if you love data, you're going to love it, because it basically tracks every year since 1982, total giving by source, and then also the recipient organizations, and also tracks against GDP. So if you were to go into the book and look, you would see it was around 60, if I remember right, about 63 billion was given back in 1983.
Thanks, Rick. Here's another one you may want to tackle from a listener here. I've begun to hear concern from nonprofits more this year than in the past, asking if it's possible for Giving USA to get the reports out, this annual report out, earlier than June, when the following giving year is already halfway through.
That's a very good question, and it's something that we wish we could do earlier. Part of the methodology relies on government data, and Una can speak to this much better than I can. But I do know that there's often delaying that, and then also from other sources such as foundations, et cetera. But Una, do you want to speak to that at all?
Yes, I think I'm glad you asked that question about where does the data come from. Government data is certainly a big part of the work that we do on individual giving, foundations, as well as corporate and bequest giving. But it's also worth noting that over the past few decades, many of those data sources have changed. For example, when you think about charitable bequests, changes in tax laws mean that fewer and fewer Americans actually filing bequests. Estate taxes only apply to very, very large estates, which means we have to rely on other data sources to get that bequest number. Similarly with household giving, as I noted in the past, about 30% of Americans filed and included their charitable giving and also received charitable deduction and recognition for their gifts. Increasingly, only 10% are filing and including their charitable giving, which means we have to rely on other data sources. And in this case, thankfully, we have a very important data source called the Philanthropy Panel Study at the Lilly Family School, which allows us to see household giving for both the folks who itemize, but also the non-itemizers.
And I'd also just jump in and say too, that part of the value, in fact, the significant value of Giving USA is what Una's talked about early on, and that is it's the longest running report on philanthropy and giving in America. And being able to look at the longitudinal data and understand those trends, I think becomes significantly important. I think you could even see that in what Una presented today.
Thanks, Rick. Una, one last question here. Has the study tracked the introduction of donors giving digital assets or cryptocurrencies? And if so, can you share any data?
Yes, the cryptocurrency question is a really good one. During the pandemic, especially, we saw an uptick in crypto giving. And in fact, many organizations were starting to figure out how to accept those gifts. Of course, that has turned out to be a much more volatile market. However, the encouraging news for organizations is that you don't have to become an expert in crypto giving. There are many intermediary organizations that can accept those crypto gifts and liquidate them and provide the cash equivalent. So we have seen that with interest in crypto, it's also something to emphasize that as new ways of giving, this is not just crypto, but this includes other types of assets, whether that's artwork, land, property, non-financial assets that donors may want to contribute. There are also a whole segment of intermediaries that are serving the nonprofit market that can help essentially convert those non-financial assets into financial assets. So for nonprofits, they don't have to take on the risk and volatility of figuring out a complex portfolio, but rather rely on an intermediary. One example, and just one of many, I know there is the Giving Block that was working with a lot of nonprofits, and with the technology, you can even have, it's called an embeddable widget on your website where organizations, donors who want to give via complex assets can make those transactions. So cryptocurrency, I think, is not necessarily going away because there's still donors that invest in those and also want to give. And there are also opportunities for nonprofits to work with third parties to accept those gifts.
Thank you, Una. This concludes our Q&A session for today, and I'd like to thank Una and Rick for these helpful insights into Giving USA 2024, the annual report on philanthropy. And if you've not yet subscribed to Giving USA, you can do so at givingusa.org. Your annual subscription gives you complete access to the entire archive of Giving USA digital products, including all past Giving USA reports, free digital copies of all special reports, and access to special webinars around relevant nonprofit topics. In addition, you get exclusive access to an interactive dashboard that allows you to compare and contrast giving trends since 1981 against household income, CPI, GDP, and much more. Finally, in the email you'll receive containing a link to the recording of this webinar today, you'll also find a link to subscribe. Feel free to share both links with your friends and colleagues. Thank you again for joining us for this Dunham & Company webinar on Giving USA 2024, the annual report on philanthropy. Have a great day.